Elden Ring is finally here. We are continuing today with my rankings of the best bosses in Demon Souls, but I couldn't proceed with my first video post Elden Ring trailer drop without mentioning it, and personally I absolutely loved it. I thought it looked like the perfect continuation of Dark Souls 3, and maybe it's just me, but I even got some Sekiro vibes, to be honest. I saw some complaints about the graphics, and maybe it's my terrible eyesight, but I thought the world, especially the large tree that looks to be a main part of the story, looked gorgeous, and the game even had some vibrant colors in some of the environments. I'm contemplating making a top 10 things I'd like to see in Elden Ring type of video, but as I'm still learning about you guys, I don't totally know if this is something you'd care about or not. Definitely let me know down below if you'd like to see this, otherwise the Sekiro boss rankings will be next. Anyways, continuing with Demon Souls, I came a little bit late to the Soulsborne series as a whole, so I missed the heyday of the original Demon Souls. However, being that the Soulsborne series has quickly become my all-time favorite, Demon Souls had been on my radar to eventually go back and play for some time. King's Field aside, I had always wanted to go back and play the original at least once, so I was beyond ecstatic when the long-time rumored Demon Souls remake was announced last summer at the PlayStation 5 reveal event. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you guys it has become one of my favorite games of all time. Speaking solely on the remake, like I said though, I absolutely love this game, and despite some unbalanced gameplay, it is overflowing with charm and is just plain fun. I plan on going back and playing the original PS3 version sooner rather than later, but having not done so at the time of this video, this countdown and analysis will be 100% based on the remake. From what I understand, the mechanics and gameplay are exactly the same, but there is some debate about the changes in soundtrack and atmosphere amongst people who loved the original version. Just to recap, we have now completed videos for Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. Links for those videos in the description if you are interested. A quick reminder, our rankings are based on gameplay, boss aesthetic, arena design, lore, and soundtrack. The categories are then added up, giving each boss a total score. It's not a perfect system, but it gives me some framework to make these videos. I would imagine these rankings are going to have the least amount of consensus by far, as many bosses have unique traits that are going to be enjoyed or not, depending on the person. I'm pretty certain each individual's rankings on these bosses would vary wildly from one person to the next. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the video. Let's get into it. Leechmonger. I don't think many of you will have a problem with me ranking Leechmonger last on this list. While the idea of a swamp creature buried deep into the depraved chasm is good in concept, the mechanics of the fight in practice don't come off very well. The arena is actually pretty unique, as with many Demon Souls fighting grounds, and the entrance to the fight itself is well done, as the idea of climbing down the rickety makeshift planks to the boss in the pit of the swamp below as he fires leeches at you makes a lot of sense. This can be very tense on your first playthrough when you don't know what to expect once you get down there, especially considering you can become entrapped in the leeches he shoots at you for a moment, which is pretty nasty. However, once you do reach the bottom, you find that all Leechmonger really offers are a series of knockback attacks. They can be pretty difficult to read and dodge, but they don't deal enough damage to cause an issue. At first, I thought maybe the rock platform was available as a reprieve from the swamp water, which could be poisonous, giving you the dilemma to either take the poisoning and give yourself more space, or stay on the high ground. It doesn't appear that you can be poisoned here though, so I guess it's just a design choice. As you can see in this footage, I often come to the Valley of Defilement as late as possible, so I am pretty overleveled here, which is why I had to start goofing around to get the proper amount of footage recorded. As far as I can tell, the Leechmonger doesn't have any significant lore to save him either, which solidifies his bottom spot on the list. Dirty Colossus. In a similar way to Leechmonger, I do appreciate the concept and design of Dirty Colossus, but I don't know if it necessarily comes off in practice. He also has his back against the wall from the start, as he caps off surely one of the most despised areas in the entire series. Dirty Colossus has a fairly limited moveset and really barely moves, other than swinging his clubbing arm at you, farting out mosquitoes, and quick-firing more bugs at you from his basket arm, which can actually be broken if you hit it, although I believe he can still use the same attack after it breaks. It's funny, when you rewatch your footage, you often notice things you never noticed live, one of which is the skull protruding from the top left side of his body. Other than that, his design makes sense for what he's supposed to be along with the arena and soundtrack, but I doubt he'll be very high up on anyone's list of excellent bosses. Vanguard Demon. I'm not gonna lie, having decimated the Asylum Demon on my first Dark Souls playthrough, I thought I was going to obliterate Vanguard on my first try, as he was a seemingly very similar boss. Little did I know, he can basically one-shot you at this point in the game. Never mind my fury when I realized there was no rematch, as I didn't know about the Vanguard Demon in 4.1 at the time. Although this is technically a different Vanguard Demon anyhow. Of course, as with many bosses in Demon Souls, Vanguard becomes tremendously easier in subsequent fights once you learn to enter the room quickly and stay either behind him or tucked under his right arm wielding his massive axe. I played around with him a little bit here, just for the sake of grabbing some extra footage, and almost paid the price getting cute with this roll dodge. Vanguard actually looks pretty cool for what he's supposed to be, especially with the glowing red eyes, and who can't laugh at his jiggling butt cheeks as well. The arena and soundtrack get the job done, and I would say that Vanguard Demon is a perfectly serviceable intro area boss. Adjudicator. The Adjudicator certainly has to be one of the silliest bosses in the entire Souls series. I'm still not entirely sure where the Adjudicator's face ends and where the golden bird that sits atop begins. My very first fight with the Adjudicator was certainly one of my all-time dumbest gaming moments. I entered the arena and read the player messages on the ground alluding to taking out the bird. Maybe it's just my terrible hearing, but I swear the echoing bird calls sounded like they were coming from above, so I spent 10 minutes looking at the hole in the ceiling of the arena that vaguely looks like it could hold a nest. Extremely confused, I eventually got tongued to death by the Adjudicator below, and after a few more deaths fell to pure black, which I think we all know what 4.1 in pure black entails, especially on a first playthrough. Anyways, after spending 2 hours trying to kill Satsuki's Black Phantom, I eventually realized our golden friend sat atop the Adjudicator's head, and I took him out with the good old crossbow. In later playthroughs, I realized how ridiculous this boss was when I found out you could simply slash away at his wound until he toppled over, in which case you could go to town on the bird. Further making this a bit goofy is how easy it is to simply walk back and forth to avoid Adjudicator's strikes. It's this sort of silliness that makes me love Demon Souls though, as I just get so much laughter out of this game. The lore and the item descriptions don't run nearly as deep in Demon Souls, but it is interesting that the Adjudicator's shield has a quote that reads, "The hero of storms shall ne'er act in cowardice, nor shall he devour a single bird of the sky. If the dead fail to please the Adjudicator's master, the harvest gold crow, their carcasses shall be gnawed upon until nothing but bones remain." Dragon God. I'm sure many of you assumed Dragon God would be dead last, and really the main reason that he isn't is because of his spectacular aesthetic design in the remake. Yes, I will grant you the fight itself isn't the best, and many of you would rank it somewhere along the lines of the Bed of Chaos in Dark Souls, but I don't think we can discount how awesome his design looks here. Even the arena looks decently cool, especially with the framing of Dragon God's face between the pillars as you enter the lair. Unfortunately, the gameplay itself is what really lets this fight down. Puzzle bosses, when done well, can be really enjoyable experiences, but this is one that on a first playthrough is frustrating, and on subsequent playthroughs feels like a chore. Even once you figure out the pattern, the entire puzzle consists of waiting for the Dragon God to look in the opposite direction and running for it. Granted, the idea of taking down this boss with the two ballistas is pretty fun, especially watching the cutscenes on your first run. I didn't do it here, but you can even finish off Dragon God with the Hands of God weapons for a trophy. From what I understand, the Dragon God at the end of the pre-game journey to the Nexus is actually a different Dragon God entirely. The Dragon God's soul can be traded with Saint Urbane for God's Wrath, which makes sense as he is supposed to hold a great godlike power, but I couldn't find any super significant lore outside of that. With a solid but not spectacular soundtrack, the main redeeming quality of this fight may be that it houses one of the most fun weapons in the game, that being the Dragon Bone Smasher. Maneater. This may end up being the most divisive entry on the list as far as ranking goes. I really don't know if people like this boss or not. He is difficult, but just because a boss is difficult doesn't always mean he's good, as this boss can be infuriating for a number of reasons, mainly being its really janky AI, which causes one or both of the Maneaters to fly into the ether and just chill out for a bit, not to mention being close to victory and then being launched off the side of the bridge. That being said, I'm probably in the minority, but actually like the arena even though I gave it a low score. I think one of the strengths of Demon Souls is the uniqueness and sheer variety of arenas, as in newer games, especially Dark Souls 3, many of the arenas are basically just empty rectangles, although in fairness, that does cater a bit more to the combat of Dark Souls 3. The combat often feels much more like survival here, as almost all your movements revolve around staying as centered in the bridge as you can, or playing Ring Around the Rosie with the fire chalice in the middle. The Maneater does pose a unique threat of magical and physical attacks in terms of combat, and if you don't take the first out soon enough, dealing with two can be a nightmare. Maneater is arguably the most difficult boss in the game, but I'll be really curious to see where people rank the fight in terms of design. The bosses in Demon Souls aren't particularly lore heavy, but Maneater does have a couple of interesting notes. Apparently, they are creations of the old monk. If you look closely, you can see that the wings and tail, which is a serpent, are actually fused on. Supposedly, there's a mechanic and shift in Maneater if you cut off his tail, but I couldn't really pick this out in my own footage or gameplay, to be honest. Let me know below if anyone notices anything, whether you have cut the tail off of either Maneater or not. Lastly, the corpse at the end of the bridge post-fight is the only one in the game with 2 souls on it, which makes sense considering the Maneater carries the mixed demon soul, which can be used by Blacksmith Ed to create the Needle of Eternal Agony. Fool's Idol. The first time I ever played Demon Souls, I checked everywhere in the level except where the magic prisoner upstairs was. I even checked the opposite hallway, looked over at him and thought, wonder what he does, and just proceeded on to the boss, took out Fool's Idol, and assumed the game must be glitched like a complete noob. That aside, much of Demon Souls was a complete joy to see how original ideas for bosses began, with Fool's Idol seemingly being a precursor to later bosses like Celestial Emissary in Bloodborne or Deacons of the Deep in Dark Souls 3. The words I keep coming back to are memorable and unique, which really push forth the overall charm of the game for me. I like hard bosses just as much as anyone, but much of Demon Souls goes to show not every boss needs to have its difficulty ramped up to 10. Fool's Idol can still be a tough early game challenge, as her magic can be quite punishing, especially if you are caught in her pentagram-like shock circles and multiple clones hit you with magic simultaneously. You have to look closely, but the main idol's magic actually is slightly larger in size than the clones, with the main idol casting Soul Ray and the clone's Soul Arrow. The obvious giveaway is the main idol not having an individualized health bar above her head. Lore-wise, the Fool's Idol is actually controlled by the old monk and was created to literally fool people into believing the queen was still alive. Even though I haven't played the PS3 version yet, I did look up a video of the fight on PS3, and the gorgeous stained glass aside, I can't help but think a lot of the creepy and terrifying atmosphere was lost in the remake of this fight. That aside, this was still a memorable boss fight for me. King Alant. This one was extremely difficult to rank because he's seated in a really cool location and holds a huge amount of lore, but the fight itself is really more of a storytelling device than an actual boss encounter. He just happens to have a boss health bar at the bottom of the screen. I can't say much about the combat as there really isn't any, but again, I don't really think that that's the point here. While it's not literally part of the fight, the cinematics of the massive sword slipping out of the main statue's hand and breaking the floor down to the Nexus, along with the Maiden in Black summoning of the old one, are fantastic. His design 100% makes sense for the story, but I doubt anyone will argue he should rank highly aesthetically. Taking into account the exterior design as well, his arena is excellently designed, creating a great atmosphere, especially considering the space did not need to be designed for combat. I know many of you feel like this fight is a bit of an anticlimax, but as I mentioned, he does have to score extremely highly in lore. On a quick note, as item descriptions are very limited in Demon Souls, the majority of the lore I reference in this video was taken from both the Demon Souls fandom or Souls Lore Wikidot pages. Anyways, fully known as King Alant the 12th, he was formerly a heroic king who fought bravely against the demons from the First Scourge, and he was held in very high regard by the people of Boletaria. King Alant, however, sought further power and became the demon known in-game as Old King Alant, or the False King, after basically selling his soul to the Old One. What we find in this fight is a mangled, toad-like figure of what is left of Alant, from being corrupted and transferring his power and being into his demonic reflection, high upon the castle in the prime of his powers. Eventually, Alant became unhappy, reawakened the Old One, and had it end human existence with the Second Scourge. In the final act, the player can choose to succeed Alant's power, or have the Maiden in Black lull the Old One back to slumber. Personally, I consider Old King Alant the final boss of the game, and the real King Alant more as a storytelling device. Old Monk. As with the Half-Light entry in Dark Souls 3, your enjoyment of the Old Monk is going to vary wildly based on if you like PvP or not, what type of player summons in, and lastly, how they decide they're going to fight you. Personally, I completely love the Old Monk fight and all the shenanigans involved. This is personally one of my favorite all-time moments summoning in as a blue phantom. I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty happy with myself after this. I'm going to splice in some various clips, as unfortunately on my own playthrough the connection was super laggy, as you can see here. Like I said, being someone who loves PvP, this fight was made for me, but if you don't want to deal with the nonsense the fight can entail, you also have the offline version of the monk, which in honesty can be a little generic as the stand-in just slashes away with claws and throws in a homing soul arrow now and then. I'd highly recommend at least giving Monk a couple of shots online if you don't like PvP, and then switching to offline if you really dislike it. That being said, for every fight you'd have to repeat the Hallway of Doom, which can be a complete nightmare for newer players. The hallway was obviously implemented to give the game time to establish a connection and load players as the monk, back when online technology was obviously much less capable. Obviously, some trick to allow a connection needs to happen, and as I discussed in the Dark Souls 3 video, I think they made some really good adjustments in the Half-Light fight. Mainly, the player loading in as the boss after the host instead of before, like an old monk, which circumvents the majority of the aforementioned PvP shenanigans. Just one lore note, the monk's head wrappings that were once the golden robe of the weazened usurper of Latria, which took possession of the weary old man. It is thought that the old monk was a noble of Latria and was exiled for unknown reasons, but returned with terrible demons leading to the fall of Latria. He now oversees the hideous experiments and construction of creatures across the land. Again, you'll like or hate this fight depending on your level of interest in PvP. Old Hero. I think a lot of people probably will not look too fondly at Old Hero, mostly because he's at the end of a level that is a complete nightmare for new players. As with many of the bosses in Demon Souls, he doesn't present a straight up melee combat affair, although you can play him that way if you really wanted to. Most players will probably utilize the Thief Ring and watch the blind Old Hero stagger around the room in search of you, however. I believe Soul Form diminishes his aggro in finding you as well, but I haven't confirmed that myself. Once you figure out his mini puzzle, Old Hero becomes significantly easier, making him a breeze on subsequent runs, as long as you don't get too greedy. One of my favorite parts about this fight is that you can actually see his mummified figure as you make your way down to the arena. The arena being what I imagine is a tomb, combined with the subtle but haunting theme, can create a pretty tense atmosphere on a first run, especially with the lingering thought of having to complete the entire 4-2 run again. His glowing yellow color along with his massive curved sword I'm assuming a version of the large sword of searching, gives him a pretty cool aesthetic. Speaking of the old hero's soul, it can be traded for this sword, or Second Chance, perhaps the most useful miracle in the game. According to the Souls Lore Wikidot, the old hero is an amalgamation of a hero, which the Shadow Men formed into a demon by the fog, and is placed in this location in hopes he would have his chance, in death, to be accepted by the Storm King, as all great heroes in their culture were. Phalanx. The first boss you'll encounter in the main game. Phalanx might be ranked a little high for some, but based on how I score the bosses, she ranks highly in each category as she is pretty solid across the board, having a cool Spartan shield formation inspired design, a heroic sounding theme, and relatively fun gameplay for an early boss. The real name of Phalanx is actually Alant, whose Black Phantom form we meet in the 4th stage of the Boletarian Palace, has several connections to the Shrine of Storms, as her white bow can be found there, along with her Collige, which is used by the skeletons. Even her leather armor is sold by Grave Robber Blige. The fight itself generally consists of launching the many fire bombs found in 1-1 at Phalanx, followed by attacking with a weapon buffed with pine resin. I generally try to pick off each individual hoplite so I can mess around with the center blob. I think it was an excellent choice to make Phalanx a pretty forgiving boss, as Vanguard Demon is a rude introduction to the Souls series if you've never played before. He's like, this is what you can expect later on. However, Phalanx gives the player some reprieve and confidence rather than just getting decimated twice in a row by bosses. I don't know if this was planned out like this or not, but it works out pretty well. Overall, another very creative boss who I quite enjoy engaging in battle. Flamelurker. Good old Flamelurker. Likely the hardest boss in the game, along with Maneater, Flamelurker can be an absolute nightmare if you come across him early in-game or with an ineffective build for him. I battled him fairly late in this playthrough, so I had quite a bit of leeway, but even so, he was still difficult as Flamelurker's attacks can be very quick, deceiving, and difficult to read. Although his janky AI sometimes plays in your favor, giving you a moment to heal. While maybe not intended, his jankiness makes sense in a way as he is basically made out of rocks and molten lava. Speaking of body type, it's subtle, but I appreciate the sound design as he moves around the arena. I know there are a few differences from the original people take issue with, but having just played the remake, I think Bluepoint did a great job with the actual noises the bosses make for the most part. Not the themes, but the actual sounds as they move around. Again, it's something you may not even take note of, but it really blends into the entire atmosphere of an encounter. Flamelurker definitely has one of the cooler arenas in the game, with the laid out dragon bones and VIP room he breaks out of in the cinematic before the fight. An interesting bit of lore involves the Hands of God, found near the Flamelurker's arena, which mention the Big M, thought to use his fists to slaughter dragons, as in how you earn a trophy via the Dragon God fight. Continuing this line, blacksmiths Baldwin and Ed each hold a Hand of God, which could mean they are descended from Big M, as in the Boletarian world, trades are usually passed down to the next generation of the family. Lastly, it is the searing demon souls of Flamelurker that you give to Ed in order to create more advanced weapons. While probably one of the more infuriating bosses once you add in his sweet arena and grand theme, Flamelurker is definitely one of the best bosses in Demon Souls. Armor Spider. This is going to be one of the entries I'm looking most forward to seeing how you guys would have ranked down below in the comments, as Armor Spider is one of my favorite bosses in the game, but I'm honestly not confident everyone would agree with that. For me, he's one of the most fun and creative bosses, and perhaps I'm a little biased by the fact he was included in some of the marketing videos prior to release, when my excitement to play Demon Souls was at a 12 out of 10. I really do enjoy this boss though, as I love the atmosphere, including those first few haunting violin notes. that play as you enter the fog and make your way down the tunnel, dodging, or not, dodging the fireballs and web attacks, along with rolling through. His physical slashing from close range has always felt really satisfying to me. I even love the aesthetic of his tar and fire attack, which resets your run back to him. I know some of you dislike this part, but I love trying to roll dodge my way back up the arena untouched. I've mentioned it a few times, but one of the highlights of Demon Souls is the varied uniqueness and creativity in arena design, which makes each fight feel special and more memorable. While Armor Spider doesn't hold much in the way of lore, you can trade his hard Demon Soul for Fire Spray or Ignite, or give it to Blacksmith Ed to ascend the short bow into the lava bow. Lastly, touching on the Armor Spider itself, the design of how he almost encapsulates the end of the tunnel with his legs planted in the ground around the arena, along with his glowing red eyes, make him pretty damn cool and one of the best bosses in the game, at least in my humble opinion. Storm King. I'm sure it's mostly because I'm one of those people that loves the rain, especially thunderstorms, but this is actually one of my favorite arenas in the game. When you add in the cinematic orchestra booming in the background, this is the perfect atmosphere for an end-world fight to me. I will end up mentioning this a few times in later entries, but I think Bluepoint did a great job with the sound design in this game, and this is a great example as I love the sounds the storm beasts make as they fly around and snipe their magic stingers at you. In addition, the sound design on the Storm Ruler is fantastic as well, as you really feel like you're wielding the power of the sky when you use it. As much as I am glowing about this battle, I will say the combat isn't the most exciting in subsequent playthroughs. One thing I would critique is I'm not the biggest fan of bosses who go out of range for such a long period of time, as taking control from the player in this fashion doesn't usually lead to fun gameplay. Just a small gripe though, as I know the average player will run through once or twice, not 37 times like some of us. One subtle, but one really nice touch is when the Storm King flies over you, he actually blocks out the rain. It's small details like this that often are in your subconscious, but can add up to really create a great atmosphere. Along with the atmosphere and soundtrack, the massive nature of the Storm King and vibrant green contrasted on his black exterior and rain particles make him one of the cooler looking bosses. One note on lore, the Shadowmen believed the beasts brought forth the rain and were ruled by the god Storm King, according to the Souls Lore Wikidot. It is thought that the Reapers are using the souls of the Storm Beasts to summon Shadowlurkers and reanimate the skeletons. Taking into account the whole package, Storm King is one of the best bosses in Demon Souls. Maiden Astraya. For the 100th time in this video, I love the uniqueness of the arena and idea behind the boss design, as this is just another example of the creativity in Demon Souls. As far as the fight goes, I have to show you guys this moment where my controller runs out of battery. I mean, I clearly saw the message a half hour back saying the battery was running low, but I thought, no, don't even worry about that. I'm sure it'll work itself out. I say I'll get it in a minute and then completely forget about it. Am I the only one that does this? Anyways, while the fight can be a little awkward battling Garl Vinland in the small corridor, is he not one of the coolest looking characters you've ever seen? Especially when you take into account his armor with the purple glow, him wielding the dark silver shield and brand, and the fact he can cast God's Wrath. Add in the fact that Maiden Astraya holds her own, especially lore-wise, and this is definitely one of the most memorable duos in the entire series. Maiden Astraya's official game description, which I'm assuming means guidebook, states, "She is a pure soul who has gone into the valley of defilement to help the wretched and the suffering who dwell there. Neither she nor her bodyguard, Garl Vinland, have been seen since they entered the fog." She is also known as Sixth Saint Astraya. She had slowly lost her faith in God due to the sheer horror of the Valley of Defilement and accepted her demonhood upon her journey. She began taking the souls of the depraved in order to numb their pain, which enhanced their devotion to her, causing them to attack unwanted intruders. Although her actions came from a place of empathy, She in essence steals any culture that was left in the valley and helps the old one in destroying everything, as the Death Cloud description reads. Astraya, who willingly accepted the corrupted and corroded, naturally became the most corrupted of them all. I'm no literary expert, so that might not be exactly correct, but I believe that's the gist of it. Feel free to correct any of those details below. I recognize the original theme is much more memorable, but it's still quite good, and this is certainly one of the most memorable bosses in the entire Souls series. Penetrator. Surely one of the most badass and slick looking bosses in the entire series, the inclusion of the Penetrator's armor in this remake was more than a welcome addition. His armor is absolutely pristine in this game, not to mention his curse weapon buff, which looks fantastic as well. Gameplay wise, Penetrator actually isn't as difficult as you would think in subsequent runs, as he actually only performs a handful of attacks. He has a diving sweep, a twirling slash, and a couple of other side-to-side attacks that are not too difficult to time. The one big attack you do need to look out for is his signature thrust attack, imbued with fire. If you're having trouble with Penetrator, remember to grab the Iron Ring of Keys from the Fat Official and rescue Bjor back just before the Tower Knight. I chose not to rescue him here because he really changes the mechanics of the fight by taking the Penetrator's attention. One thing I absolutely love about this fight is the sound design of the Penetrator's armor and general movements. I'm not sure what it sounded like in the original, but I think Bluepoint really nailed that. I love the idea of the arena being a hall of knight statues just before making the final push towards the king. Penetrator's actual name is Metas, whose black phantom form you'll meet shortly in 1.4. Metas served as part of the Knights of the Round Table of Boletaria, as Penetrator is his corrupted demon form. Penetrator's armor sets indicate they were crafted specifically for him and mention him as a Boletarian hero. It's interesting to note the Penetrator fight seems like an obvious precursor to many of the humanoid action-oriented bosses later in the series. While not the most difficult to master, one of the most fun fights in the entire game. Tower Knight. Even though I've mentioned a couple of times that I never played the original, I have listened to many of the original soundtracks quite a few times and absolutely love a number of them, especially Maiden Astraya's and Tower Knight's. I think the memorability and nostalgia for the older tracks lies in their simplicity, whereas I think Bluepoint over-elaborated a little too much in the remake. Not that the tracks don't sound pleasing to the ear, but this over-elaborating takes a lot of the uniqueness out of the themes. In fact, if you never heard the original Tower Knight theme, you'd still think this is an epic warlike anthem, as it still sounds tremendous. The main draw for the Tower Knight, though, is of course his aesthetic, as he's one of the coolest looking bosses in the entire Souls series. The oversized knight with giant lance and shield of gargantuan proportions is truly a sight to behold. On top of all that, he can cast magic. Who's cooler than the Tower Knight? Granted, once you figure out how to stay behind Tower Knight and avoid his attacks, the combat becomes pretty limited, but on that first playthrough, it's quite terrifying given his preposterous size. If you want the extra challenge, you could leave the archers standing, which actually nets you a trophy. Following Ulan as Phalanx and Metas as Penetrator, Tower Knight is actually the demon manifestation of Alfred, one of the Knights of the Boletarian Round Table and the third of the Black Phantoms you'll meet in the 4th level of the Boletarian Palace. Tower Knight's Iron Demon Soul can be swapped for warding, which makes sense given its defensive properties. Touching on the arena, which I have to think later inspired the one reborn in Bloodborne, the design makes perfect sense as you can run up to the top and take out the archers while getting a full view of the Tower Knight's massive figure, which plays really well. Given Tower Knight's high marks in all categories, he's certainly one of the most memorable in the entire series. Old King Alant. When I began making this list, I had no idea who my #1 boss would end up being. In fact, if I asked 5 people who they thought the best boss in Demon Souls was, I wouldn't be surprised at all if I got 5 different answers. In fact, Old King Alant Tower Knight and Penetrator finished with the exact same scores, and then I just made my own personal picks from there, but the top 3 are really interchangeable for me. Old King Alant ended up number 1 in my rankings as he scored highly in gameplay, soundtrack, arena, and obviously lore. Starting with the gameplay, if you've seen my previous lists, you've probably noticed I tend to bias towards action-oriented humanoid opponents, and given Alant was created back in 2009, I'd argue his combat still holds up pretty well. He has a really nice variety of close-range slashing attacks, jumping attacks, ranged wind attacks, one large AoE, and this, which we're just gonna pretend this never happened. You never saw this. Seriously though, I always enjoy and look forward to this fight from a combat perspective. I absolutely love the arena, especially the long elevator ride up into the King's Chamber after having battled through the entire Boletarian Palace. This really feels like a nice way to cap off the game before heading down below to the Nexus. The soundtrack as you enter the room is one of the most memorable in the game for me, and it's arguably my favorite in the game, although I could definitely pick others depending on the day. It just feels so awe-inspiring to me, like you finally reached the king, although his corrupted form. I covered the majority of the lore in the regular King Alant entry, but I will mention you do pick up the Demon brands here, and you use the False King's Soul as he drops to create the Northern Regalia, along with the Soul Brand you'll collect below the Nexus. Lastly, I should mention Old King Alant's attire looks spectacular. The white with the gold trim, along with the physics on his cape and even gold chain are just perfect. I think his face could have looked more demonic given what he's supposed to be, but Bluepoint nailed his clothing. As I mentioned, you could definitely argue a handful of others, but Old King Alant takes the top slot on my list of best bosses in Demon Souls.
How did you defeat my demonic reflection?
On a side note, as I don't yet have access to community polls yet, please let me know below how many of you guys play related Souls games and would be interested in content from Hollow Knight, Neo, and other similar titles. If not, that is totally fine, as I will stick with the plan of covering the main 6 FromSoftware games, continue with topics such as Chalice Dungeon bosses in Bloodborne, area rankings, weapons rankings, and anything else we could think of. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed my Demon Souls rankings. I hope to see you soon as we complete the series with our Sekiro boss rankings. Have a great day, everyone. This has been Ghost Riposte. Peace.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.